I certainly can, McLean. So I always joke, if anybody ever asks you about economics, finance, or investments, and you want to sound smart, you should say it has a lot to do with interest rates. People say, what about them? And you want to sound smart, you say they fluctuate. They say, is that good news or bad news? You say, it depends. Can you tell me more? Right. The longer you can go without answering a question, the smarter you're going to sound. Right. That's called the Socratic method. Right. I would remind you that Socrates was put to death for being too much of a Socratic person. Right. Anyways, this is, I love that Brian has got out his whiteboard. And the reason I love that is because it is indeed an answer set on the test. That is the answer set. So you need to know where the money is coming from, McLean, and where the money is going to. The prime rate test question is what banks charge their best commercial customers. I joke, McLean, this is what you pay to borrow money if you don't need to borrow any. This is what Apple pays or Google pays. I thought this was fascinating, Brian. Formerly, ExxonMobil had AAA credit, according to Standard & Poor's. And Standard & Poor's put them on credit watch and said, listen, you're distributing too much of your capital through dividends distributions. You're spending too much on capital expenditures, and we might have to downgrade you to AA. And we know how important that AAA credit quality is to you. And I love ExxonMobil's answer. They said, no, we are more important to us as our shareholders. We pride ourselves at ExxonMobil as having a dividend that only goes one way, up. And through the business cycle, we're a blue chip. Through good times and bad in the oil and gas business, we kept doing what we do. We spend billions finding oil in Belize, billions in dividends. And then I love what they said, and we don't need to issue any bonds to finance our business activities. If we need money, we can go to JP Morgan and say, can we borrow $20 billion at prime? And they say, Jamie Dimon will say, how about $40 billion? Right? So prime rate is banks to its best commercial customers. Next one, broker call. You know, McLean, a very competitive way to borrow money is using a margin account where you pledge your securities as collateral for the loan. You know, here recently, Skydance, the person who controls Skydance, the studio, is a guy named David Ellison. And David Ellison is Larry Ellison's son. And Larry Ellison has over $100 billion in Oracle stock, and he loves to borrow against it. I mean, he just borrowed $500 million from Morgan Stanley recently to buy the island of Lanai. When they were giving him grief about his margin account, I love his response. He said, you know, I might want to buy the Lakers someday. I said, Genie Bus, make a moat to self, right? And he would use his buying power to do so. Broker call is what banks charge brokerage firms for money, McLean. And whatever the bank charges the brokerage firm for money, we typically charge our margin customers broker call plus. What you need to know about that is that's used to finance margin accounts, debit balances, debit registers you owe your brokerage firm. Now, the only interest rate directly controlled by the Federal Reserve Board is the discount rate. That's from Fed to member bank. Test question. That is the only one that's directly controlled by the Fed. So if you need money, for example, you're a bank and you need to meet your reserve requirement, and you can't get it from a fellow bank, that's a red flag that a fellow bank won't lend you this money. You can go to the Fed window, the discount window. Beep, beep. I need $10 billion. I'm joking. But the discount rate is what the central bank, the Federal Reserve Board, charges member banks. Now, typically, McLean, when borrowing from the Fed or from a fellow bank, you're going to have to pledge collateral, typically Treasury securities. That's choice C. Choice D, test question, is what banks with excess reserves are lending to banks with deficient reserves. That Fed funds rate, test question, is the most volatile of all those interest rates. Be careful what that means. It means it changes the most often, right? So that's banks with excess reserves, lending banks with deficient reserves. And if you are deficient and I have excess and you've asked to borrow money from me, again, I'm going to want Treasury securities as collateral. So that's a answer set that is on the exam. Depending on the question will depend on your answer set. Anything you want to add to that, Brian?
Nope.